being the iwi or subgroup Ngāi Tahu, of the iwi or tribal group Ngāi Tahu. I wanted to acknowledge some of our academic staff being here, some of our students being here, and of course friends of the business school being here as well. I also used a whakatauki, and the proverb that was being used was one that really says that, translated, knowledge empowers us, much like the feathers enable a bird to fly. And I think these MBA Thought Leadership series work so well that hopefully the knowledge shared and exchanged here tonight really enhances a little bit about what everybody takes away at the end of this evening. The MBA Thought Leadership series brings together leading business minds from New Zealand and abroad to feature in these events. Industry, students and alumni are invited to be inspired by innovative and insightful expertise from executives and entrepreneurs. The series also showcases our MBA program's industry integration and provides networking opportunities for students and industry. The MBA is the flagship program of the business school. Housed on the purpose-built top floor of the Reihua building, our MBA brings together some of our best faculty and local and industry experts as classroom facilitators and mentors. The UC Business School has extensive connections to business and community organisations, and we have been recognised and accredited by 3 main international business school accreditation bodies: AACSB, Equus, and in the case of the MBA, AMBER. This means that we have achieved the prestigious Triple Crown of Business School accreditation that places the UC Business School in the top 1% of business schools globally. Additionally, in the past 12 months, we've achieved 2 new firsts for a New Zealand business school. In 2023, the UC Business School became the first institution in Australasia to successfully complete the Business School Impact System, otherwise known as BSIS, which demonstrates the positive impact our school has on our community. This year, the UC Business School was selected as one of 47 business schools internationally to take part in the 2024-2025 PRME Champion Cycle, to be recognised as the thought leader in the responsible management education community. The topic being addressed tonight is the very essence of making an impact and responsible leadership. In summary, sustainability is crucial for New Zealand's future, requiring a shift to low emission lifestyles and products both domestically and internationally. The key challenge is whether this transition will be well planned and controlled or chaotic and disruptive. Tonight, our speaker, Climate Change Commission Chair, Dr. Rod Carr, will address these issues and how we might lead climate transition at pace and scale. Beyond his current role, most of you will know that Rod was the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Canterbury from 2009 to January 2019, which makes his involvement tonight even more special. And Rod, my thanks to you for being here tonight. However, before we hear from Rod, I would like to introduce our MBA Director, Associate Professor Elsa Marie Balta, to the audience. In addition to her MBA Director role at UC, Elsa Marie is an extraordinary Associate Professor at the University of Stellenbosch Business School, South Africa. With 15 years of consulting experience and experience assisting from small businesses to large corporates, Elsa Marie's research focuses on adopting and monetising new technology in organisations and digital strategy development, focusing on artificial intelligence. With a PhD in Industrial Economics and Management from KTH Royal Institute of Technology, Stockholm, Elsa Marie has published in leading international journals. She has also been recognised as a LinkedIn top voice in both higher education and consulting, and has various advisory and governance positions. Elsa Marie, please come up to the stage.
Thank you, Paul. Now, tonight I am going to talk a little bit about our MBA, but what these events are about is about showcasing that industry connectedness, not only of the MBA program, but also of the business school and the university at large. We're really all about leveraging being a hub, actually, for businesses, their employees, helping businesses thrive, not only in Canterbury, but across the whole New Zealand and abroad. We do that through multiple initiatives, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But what's really at the heart of what these events are about is helping leaders become more impactful and helping leaders lead their companies better. And of course, sustainability is a key part of that and all the changes around it. Now, we asked Rod to be a speaker many months ago already, and it's just fortuitous that sustainability is so topical again at the moment, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But allow me about 10 minutes just to talk about the broader context of our programs. And I think one of those key issues that we, us as leaders, worry about is not just one, right? That's the answer. Now, if you've been to one of our previous thought leadership events, you'll recognize this slide, and that's absolutely where we find ourselves as leaders in organizations in a polycrisis world. We don't just have to think about one thing. We have to think about economic, societal, environmental, geopolitical, and technological changes, which create a storm of change that is sometimes too stressful for our employees. We're doing interviews at the moment around resilience, around disaster, and a sentence from one of the leaders of the organization just stays with me, and that's, death by 1,000 cuts. But there's also kind of an abundance mindset to this, where we're like, actually, this environment of fast-paced change creates opportunities for leaders. And I think that's really what Rod is going to talk about today as well, some opportunities for us as leaders. But what does this mean for us in organizations? And what does this mean for us as employees and people who are going to be in the workforce for a few more years, many more years? It means that we need to reskill and upskill. So I found this McKinsey Global Institute report, Jobs Lost, Jobs Gained, in the time of automation. And it says by 2030, as many as 375 million workers, or roughly 14% of the global workforce, may need to switch occupational categories because of all the technological change and the changes in the workforce happening at the moment. That means that you and I will have multiple careers still, and not necessarily in the jobs that we started off with, or studied for, or didn't even study for, right? I looked for something a little bit more local, and Pivot and Pace, with Kendall Langston being on the advisory board of the MBA. Nick Carter is here as well from Brannigan's, another advisory board member, Graham Grant Sequent. We have some international advisory board members who we're really thankful for. But this recent report from 1,500 leaders that they surveyed, 42% of businesses lacked adequate staff capabilities and expertise in essential roles. So it won't be a surprise if I say, what do we need right now? We need to upskill and reskill. But none of us have the time or the resources to necessarily leave our workplaces. And us as a university need to respond to that, right? So given the current economic climate, this idea of earn while you learn has become really central to what we do as a university. But I think a step beyond that, this isn't news, but if we further that, I think it's really important for us as leaders in organizations to make sure that that earn while you learn counts for employees. We need to invest in their next occupation, their next career, and that sometimes means that we need to do credit-bearing university work. So earn while you learn, or continuous development that counts. Now, that's part and parcel of why our UC Strategic Vision 2020 to 2030 is really focused on accessible, flexible, and future-focused education, and why our business school is in the business of making a difference. Within that broader ecosystem, we find the MBA department, that focuses on developing impactful leaders. Now, we realize that those impactful leaders are working busy interacting with employees, and they need programs that are incredibly flexible and accessible, something that they can work into their daily lives and apply tomorrow. So a key cornerstone of all our programs is accessibility and applicability while you work. So not only do we have the MBA, we're also very, very proud to bring back our very popular postgraduate certificate in strategic leadership that really looks at upskilling employees who are in new roles, new management roles, who need that additional support. We look at courses like leading themselves, where key core leadership capabilities are taught, team leadership capabilities in leading others, how do they lead change initiatives and change within the organization, how do they develop and implement strategies, manage people and performance, lead complex systems, and of course this extends further into our MBA. I should mention that this program is really something that we're catering for organizations for. So if you want to build a postgraduate certificate in strategic leadership in your organization, there's some online content there, there's some in-person content there, block days. It's all geared towards that delivery. And of course, our MBA, that's our flagship program, as Paul said, that is impacting so many lives. And has impacted so many lives. But that future-focused, interdisciplinary approach is really a core to that. But I think what we don't mention enough is the often intangible. I wrote invisible because I couldn't remember intangible. It's not invisible. It's just intangible. Benefits of engaging with a university for further education and using the university as a platform for further educating your employees. And there are numerous benefits, right? You're accessing a network, a cohort of people. You're accessing government funding because we get SAC funding for those courses. You are accessing an infrastructure of support that no single provider can really grant. So there's libraries and wellness, there's a gym, there are so many additional benefits. And of course, if you're part of the MBA department, executive education, there are some other benefits like workshops and networking events like this one that many people just don't have access to. The list goes on, but I think one of the initiatives that we're the proudest of is our commitment to continuous learning. That's 100% in the vein of what we've been talking about tonight and what we'll continue to talk about as a business school and as a program, and that is our commitment to continuous learning. So as part of our commitment to continuous learning, every graduate from the MBA program can come back and do one free course per year as our commitment to keep our graduates up to date and invested. So that's why we have graduates like Paul who attest to the life-changing nature of how we approach leadership development.
When I started my MBA, I was principal of a primary school. As a result of the MBA, I'm now a business partner for a business consultancy, and I would never have been at this place if it wasn't for Canterbury's MBA program. It's been life-changing. I've benefited hugely, not only from the lecturers and the academic staff, but from my classmates, and have made lifelong friends and business partners as a result of that study.
So if you're interested in upskilling your employees, doing either credit-bearing or not for credit courses or some of those programs, please come and talk to us, either through the MBA or through the executive education mailbox. There you go. That was your not free lunch. I always say. You've now paid for your drinks and nibbles. And now I can introduce Dr. Carr. So Rod has extensive experience in both public and private sector governance and leadership. He served as chair and non-executive director of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand and served as deputy governor and for a time acting governor of the bank. Dr. Carr was the founding chair of the National Infrastructure Advisory Board and for over a decade was a non-executive director of the Canterbury Employers Chamber of Commerce. He led the University of Canterbury as Vice-Chancellor for 10 years and holds a PhD in Insurance and Risk Management, a Master's in Applied Economics and Managerial Science, an MBA in Money and Finance, and an honours degree in Law and Economics. Talk about continuous development and learning. Please welcome Dr. Carr.
And amana ina iwi tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for coming along tonight. I hope you will take away questions. I hope that this presentation and your opportunity to ask me questions will stimulate your thinking. When I was reflecting on the nature of the business of climate and the climate business, I thought it was important to talk about opportunities, not just challenges. But to some extent, you cannot show the size of the opportunity until you reveal the size of the prize. So let us back up the bus a little and talk about the changing climate. The climate is changing. It has always changed on this planet. There have been times when it has been hotter, much hotter than it is today or is forecast to be this century. There are times when there have been multiples of the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere than there are today or likely to be this century. But here's the rub. For the last 300 million years, the planet's average surface temperature is estimated to have oscillated between -4 degrees and +2 degrees Celsius compared to the average temperature between 1850 and 1900. Currently, we're at 1.2 degrees above that average and rising rapidly, with estimates that the average temperature of the planet's surface in the last year has been above 1.5 degrees. However, because we have spikes and we like averaging things, the average over the measurement period that is used internationally is hovering and rising from 1.2. Averages, however, hide some very important truths. Temperature doesn't show up as an average. The measured temperatures over the North Pole are 6 to 8 degrees warmer than they have been compared to our best information from the 1850-1900 period. That the increases in temperature are manifesting themselves as thermal expansion in the ocean mass, which accounts for about half of sea level rise, melting of glaciers, and as a result of the carbon dioxide in the air, the acidification of the ocean. These were all predictions made by scientists knowledgeable in atmospheric chemistry. In fact, most of the science explaining the theory of our changing climate was done and dusted by the 1970s. There is new science about cascading effects, tipping points, and irreversibility at lower than we expected temperature rises. But there is no new science about carbon dioxide or methane and its warming effect. That's known. And we also know that the principal cause of human-induced warming is the combustion of fossil fuels in the open air. We've known that since the 1850s. We have known that at the rate we are currently combusting fossil fuels in the open air, we will cause a change in climate that will be irreversible this century. Every year, humanity puts about 55 billion tonnes of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, measured using the internationally accepted standard of GWP 100, the global warming potential of gases over 100 years, 55 billion tonnes. That's 100 times more carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases than contributed by all the active volcanoes on the planet. And we just hit another record. We lifted and burnt 100 million barrels of oil last year, on average, every day, adding 18 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. We burnt coal that added 15 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And 80% of the coal burnt were used to make electricity globally, where we have known technologies to displace it all. We don't need to invent a single new thing to stop burning coal to make electricity. This is a failure of funding and distribution, not a failure of technology. Fossil gas comes behind coal and oil and contributes a mere 13 billion tonnes a year of carbon dioxide emissions. The challenge of climate change is a challenge of energy transition. We have built our civilization on the extraordinary abundance of energy captured in fossil fuels and liberated when it is combusted. It is the source of the energy that has enabled us to roll back the night, shrink distances, warm our homes and clothe ourselves, and feed 8 billion people. The transition from a fossil-based energy economy has been estimated by the funds management firm BlackRock to require investment of $1 billion every day for the next 30 years. The size of the prize is a livable planet. The size of the opportunity is defined by the energy equations that run our civilization. That's all grand and good, but what about New Zealand? There are 4 things New Zealand needs to do to create a low emissions, thriving and climate resilient society, where we can produce the goods and services that affluent markets will want to buy and create lifestyles that talented people will want to live. We have to decarbonise the production and use of energy in our economy. And in New Zealand, only 40% of the energy we produce and use comes from renewable sources. 40%. Don't get mesmerised by the 80 or 90% of electricity that comes from renewable sources. The opportunity is to displace the 60% of energy that is currently from the combustion of fossil fuels, fossil gas oil and coal. That will require investment, but in many cases the business cases for that transformation already stack up. Before you factor in the co-benefits of security of supply and the health benefits of not breathing this crap at ground level. Decarbonising energy production and use is key. Without it, New Zealand will get stranded producing dirty goods and services for poor countries. Decarbonising ground transportation is second most important for New Zealand. If we exclude agricultural emissions, 40% of our emissions come from transport. We have chosen to buy some of the cheapest, oldest, dirtiest cars available on the planet. We have a lot of them and we drive them a lot. That's our choice. The technologies to decarbonise much of ground transportation exist today. Energy facts. If you just take the energy required to move, petrol at $2.50 a litre has you an energy cost of 25 cents a kilometre on average for the New Zealand fleet. If you were to generate hydrogen, even at $15 a kilogram, which is that very high New Zealand production cost, your energy content of driving a fuel cell hydrogen car would be not 25 cents a kilometre for petrol, but 15 cents a kilometre for fuel cell hydrogen. If you pay 20 cents a kilowatt hour to charge your battery electric car, it's 5 cents a kilometre energy cost. That's today. We have got a capital hurdle to jump. That's a financing problem because the cost savings on the other side from lower maintenance and lower energy costs pay for the capital. It reminds us that sometimes it's about inventing new stuff and sometimes the inventions are about new ways of doing business, new business models. Decarbonising ground transportation is affordable, available, it's our choice. Land use change is the third limb of New Zealand's decarbonisation plan. We managed to burn down 10 million hectares of forests to create our pastoral lands, thereby emitting about 5 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. But you know, bygones are bygones. The Congo shouldn't burn theirs, but we burned ours. Nothing to see here. Then we graze it with ruminant livestock. But we'll find a technology to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. Trust us, it'll turn up just in time. 2027 apparently, be there. And it'll be affordable and available and taken up. But what if not? We're playing a very high regrets game. Because the reality is available technologies are already being deployed in the Northern Hemisphere that are reducing biogenic methane emissions from ruminant livestock in different feeding regimes by 30%. Already Fonterra have said that the average greenhouse gas emissions per litre of milk in Australia is about 10% below New Zealand's average emissions per litre of milk. The hubris that we are the most efficient on the planet is unhelpful in addressing the challenge, but also the opportunity of reducing our emissions for meat and milk protein production. Across New Zealand, as we get better at measuring, we get better at managing. And what we've discovered is that the between-herd differences in emissions for milk production are enormous. 18 kilograms of greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of milk solids in some herds, 8 in others. The differences between herds in New Zealand is way bigger than the differences in averages between countries. Our opportunities and their business opportunities is to better measure so we can better manage, so we can recover, not maintain, recover our slipping competitive advantage. The business opportunities are real. In dairying, it's a $23 billion export industry that is already at risk if we don't figure this out at pace and scale. And quite frankly, the climate doesn't care who you vote for. The technologies may emerge, but we already know the drivers of greenhouse gas emissions from land use are driven by ruminant pastoral agriculture. We know the drivers of that are the land type, the feeding regime, the breed of animal, and within breeding, selection. We don't need to invent a new thing to get on with doing better now, at pace. But I can assure you, if you don't put a price on emissions, there's no business case for a farmer to incur any cost to avoid them. You don't have to do Econ 101 to figure that out. So land use change is already happening. New Zealand's sheep flock is shrinking. Our dairy herds are also falling, partly as a result of the changing climate as well as changing consumer preferences. The business opportunities for reusing our land differently are enormous. And you only have to look at Country Calendar from time to time to see that farmers are embracing change, even if their peak bodies and representatives can't or won't. The businessmen farmers on the ground are seeing opportunities to use their land differently with lower emissions per unit of output. We need to pick up the pace and de-risk the pathway to a low emissions future. And then there's the waste thing. Because we have not measured, we have not managed, because we have had a sense of infinite and unlimited capacity to chuck stuff away, we have been unaware of the reducing scale of fresh water available for our use, about the near-shore environment for sustainable aquaculture. Our waste is large proportionately compared to many other countries who have not had that abundant throwaway opportunity. Per capita, we waste a lot of things. The technologies to reduce waste are already available. And they're not all about widgets and gadgets. Sometimes it's about software. Sometimes it's about efficient demand management. But if we roll up the opportunities in energy, transport, land use change, and waste and efficiency, there are significant business cases that are worth investigating, and there will be significant opportunities for New Zealanders in our own self-interest to decarbonise what we produce and how we live our lives. Don't wait for Wellington. If our elected leaders are unwilling or unable to see the future that is coming at us, it will not stop that future from arriving. The changing climate will change how we use our land. Northland will be extremely difficult to raise dairy herds in outdoors by the middle of this century. Unirrigated lands in some parts of New Zealand will no longer be able to support the pastures that currently feed our livestock. The change is going to come, whether you vote for it or not. I think New Zealand is ideally placed in our own self-interest to pick up already known technology and deploy it at accelerating pace and scale. We have probably pushed our elected leaders as far as they are likely to want to go in this electoral cycle. And the baton now passes to business leaders, civil society, and the judiciary to hold us to account for the lost opportunities that are now emerging. Increasingly, when you write a business case for decarbonisation, when you write a business case for the take-up of a new technology, ask yourself, who's in the way? Not what's in the way, who is in the way? Because in New Zealand, you're probably related to them. We are small enough to connect the dots to make the change that matters. And we have the abundance of resources that many other countries don't have. If in our progress we discover things that we can sell to the world or show to the world, all better for it. But it's not about taking the moral high ground to lead the world. We don't already. Other countries have moved to net zero commitments, all gases, all sources. We're not one of them. Some countries, Denmark, have got a target of negative greenhouse gas emissions, global cooling, because they are accepting that we are likely to bust through 1.5 degrees of global warming, and we are going to be in a world where we need to reverse, revert, claw back, cool down at pace and scale. The economic studies are pretty clear that the cost of recovery from overshoot far exceeds the cost of emissions abatement before we get way past 1.5 degrees of warming. Economics has had a lot to say about scarcity of resources. And what we now know is the capacity of the atmosphere to absorb greenhouse gas emissions while sustaining the ecosystems that we as human beings depend on and the civilization that we have created embodies is unsustainable and will not be sustained. There is much talk about just transitions, and it would be most likely that a transition that was carefully planned, transparently discussed, and consistently executed would be more inclusive, less disruptive, and carry the community with it. But this century, I can promise you, there will be a transition to a lower emissions society, with or without disruption. As we found in 1984, when the previous government had consistently maintained an overvalued exchange rate against all of the expert and independent advice and evidence, when the dam broke, the disruption in New Zealand was far greater than it was in Australia, where they had a smoother pathway. At this point, the real exchange rate between the natural environment and the financial economy is changing. Scarce natural capital is being repriced upwards, whether we like it or not. Products and services that draw heavily on scarce natural capital are going to become more expensive and less desirable. And products and services that draw lightly on natural capital will become more valued and more valuable, no matter what we want to believe. So build your business opportunities, bearing in mind Not just the size of the confronting challenge, but the size of the prize and therefore the scale of the opportunity. You can do good business and you can do good by the planet. These are not mutually exclusive. The work of the Climate Change Commission has shown that a pathway to net zero by 2050, except for biogenic methane, is affordable and achievable. And if we choose not, that's on us. It's not because it wasn't affordable, and it's not because the technology wasn't available. It's because we, in our myopic, reckless and selfish state, voted more for us now and less for them later. That's a choice. But the time when we can other this and blame China or India or America has way passed. For the simple reason that many of those countries have now reduced their emissions consistently year on year for more than a decade. They have locked in a pathway to a lower emission society. We've had a few years where we've shown a bit of downward movement, helped by COVID, helped by some rain that filled our hydro dams back there in 2022. The challenge for us is to lock in lower emissions from transport, lower emissions from land use, low emissions from energy production and use. We do that, we'll create products and services that affluent markets will want to buy, and we will create a place where talent will want to live. The alternative is we chase our tail to sell dirty products at a discount to poor markets. That's not a desirable prosperity for New Zealand. One of the big conundrums in the energy transition turns out not to be available technologies. As I've stated and repeated, most of the technologies we need to get well on the way there exist today. It's not actually the lack of good business cases or capital to fund them. We're seeing now that solar farms can pop up almost anywhere. Wind turbines are profitable the day they spin on. However, the scarcity is going to be skills, people, boots in the mud and gloves on the hands to roll the kit out at the kind of pace and scale we need. Some of the business opportunities will be about figuring out how to make skilled labour much more productive. Currently in New Zealand, half of the cost of a solar farm is the labour to install it. Doesn't matter how cheap the panels are from China, cheaper is always better. But if half the cost of the solar farm is labour, we need to figure out why. And that's a local issue, and it's not solved by just paying people less. That when it comes to transport, no amount of EV charging stations is going to reduce emissions if there are no EVs on the road. And when it comes to doubling the amount of renewable electricity we generate, it won't decarbonise 1 unit if all of the new electricity is used to fire up new data centres and make ammonia for export. We have to get it into our heads. It's not just about being seen to do things. It's actually doing the things that will make emissions lower. And forestry, for a moment. There is no doubt that after 400 million years of experimentation, nature figured out quite an effective way of dragging carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in plants and trees. It's quite good at it, really. It's also pretty clear that biological stores of carbon are at risk of damage and loss through disease, storms, fire, and age. There is an opportunity in New Zealand to use some of the changing land use to create carbon stores or capture carbon for a biomass and bioenergy economy. But if we squander the time we buy by putting some of our land under forests, by not reducing permanently gross emissions, we're not only locking up that land for the next generation, we are compelling them to continue to lock up ever more land to offset their emissions. It is also interesting to note that pine trees are not very effective as a form of plant sequestration. On average in New Zealand, a pine forest sequesters about 26 tonnes per hectare per annum. Bamboo at the equator sequesters about 260 tonnes per hectare per annum. If you really want to plant something in New Zealand to suck carbon out of the air, it's not pine forests, it's bamboo. Don't think the farmers will like that idea much either. But it does reveal the risk of treating 1 tonne of emissions of fossil carbon to the atmosphere, which lingers for up to 10,000 years, as being equivalent to 1 tonne of carbon removed into the biosphere. This is a false equivalency. Don't build a business case assuming a false equivalency will persist. The law of nature will ultimately dominate human hubris. And when it comes to international offsets, can we pay a penance, some would hope a pittance, to someone else to do more so we can do less? When the idea of netting was introduced in the Paris Agreement back in 2015-2016, it was pretty clear that it was a way of squaring an impossible circle. And the idea of offsets was that if there was additional removals compared to what a nation or nature would have done anyway, and they were permanent removals, and they could be measured accurately and enforced legally, then maybe 1 tonne of offset was equal to 1 tonne of emissions. To date, there's less than 1 million tonnes of offsets globally that meet those criteria. Some of it's about storing as carbonates. Some of it's about making sure that in geothermal fields it's injected back at temperature and pressure. The idea that flushing fossil gas fields with CO2 to release more fossil gas is helpful in reducing total emissions is delusional. So again, I would encourage the thought that you need to bring to this table is to be deeply, deeply curious about claims that are made about how we are going to permanently reduce emissions, what the technologies are that can be deployed at pace and scale, and ultimately who gets the benefit, because there you can identify who will pay. But I think there are opportunities here across the entire spectrum. The obvious ones are electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, civil engineers, and all the project managers that are going to be needed to do this stuff, as well as those able to do the innovation and research about new ways of constructing businesses, the bundling and unbundling, how we bring technical capabilities, financial capital, and user preferences together. There are going to be opportunities to think about how we use new technologies, whether it's genetic engineering, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's the new economics about how you nudge and encourage people to change their behaviours. All of that has scope and opportunity. Different people will have different challenges. Different people will see different opportunities. But as a business audience, the baton has passed from our elected leaders to someone else to take and make the progress that is in our own self-interest. That's the challenge. there's the opportunity. Kia ora.
Right on time. Thank you so much, Rod. I get to ask one or two, maybe three questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. There's apparently an elephant in the room, and it's called the Draft Emissions Reduction Plan. Maybe you want to talk about it.
So at the end of last year, the Climate Change Commission, as is required by statute, provided the government of the day advice on the direction of policy to inform what would be the government's emissions reduction plan for the period 2026 to 2030. That's all available. Those of you who are interested will have read it. If you haven't read it by now, you're not going to, so I'm not going to talk about it. So anyway, that was advice. It had 23 recommendations. And then under the legislation which set this whole thing up, the government then goes away, scratches its head, consults with everybody and anybody that it wants to, and writes a draft plan which it takes out for public consultation. And the government has released that draft plan for consultation, and you've possibly or not seen media coverage of it. What you won't see is the Climate Change Commission critiquing the government's draft plan. It's not our job. We had our say. The government now needs to make its choices. So from that point of view, good luck. What we do is each year we provide an emissions reduction monitoring report, which is not an assessment of the government, this one, that one, or the last one, but it's assessment of the plan in place and the progress that's being made against that plan, with some trajectories about what path we're on and whether that is consistent with being on track to meet our emissions budgets. The first of those annual emission monitoring reports will be out next week, and you will be able to see for yourselves whether, in the view of the Independent Expert Commission, we are on track.
Thank you. So I promised the audience that it won't be too bleak. I don't know if we delivered on that.
there was lots of opportunities. Business likes billions.
I was wondering, as I was listening, how do you, as somebody that just stays in this literature, stays on these data, talks to people who are often resistant to change or have bought into maybe false narratives or something like that, how do you as a leader stay positive and so energetic about it?
That's a really interesting question. So I think part of it is I genuinely believe there are opportunities. I mean, I think there's a sort of thing that says, well, you've got to give people hope. If there's no hope, there's no hope. There is hope, right? The reality is we now understand the science. We know the direction of policy. We now need to make some choices. So it would be more hopeless if we didn't have choices. We do have choices. The particular circumstances New Zealand is in is really quite extraordinary. I don't know what advice I would be giving as a climate change commissioner in Pakistan. Right? The Secretary General of the United Nations got back from Pakistan after their floods, right? And in their floods, 32 million people displaced, a third of the country underwater, seed stock all rotting. And he said, look, the world is looking at it as floods. He said, by the middle of this century, the glaciers that feed the rivers of the Indus Valley will be gone. And that is their drinking water and water for agriculture. And there is nothing we can do now to stop that happening. So now what's your advice? Leave, right? Leave is the best advice you could give those people. So New Zealand does not have that constraint. We are now making choices, and we should be held responsible by our kids and by the world for the choices we make. Because we have opportunities some countries don't have.
Thank you. And talking about those choices, this is, by the way, completely off script. We agreed on some questions.
You're allowed to ask any question.
Thank
I get
you.
to choose if I answer it.
Good. All right. That's a great answer. Talking about choices, do you have some examples of businesses that did it well or are doing it well, and maybe not businesses who are doing it poorly? Focusing on
I could
good.
tell you a whole sector that's doing it poorly.
Ooh.
The fossil gas sector.
Oh no. We're not supposed to be very controversial here. It is a university.
And why do I think they're doing it poorly? I think they're doing it poorly because they clearly understand the science.
Okay.
They clearly understand that there are alternatives in most cases to what we use our fossil fuel, particularly fossil gas, for. That actually in New Zealand's case, still rolling out new gas connections to residential subdivisions is an abuse of homeowners. So, the ones that are doing it well, I mean, I think it is genuinely a challenge for businesses that are of their essence based on high emitting activities. And I think the businesses that do it well are the ones that own their responsibility. So take Air New Zealand, right? Air New Zealand burns 1 billion litres of avgas a year. It is a challenge to figure out an affordable and available technology to reduce emissions from flying. And there is no near substitute to flying. You know, it is hard to get to London on a boat, right? So their challenge is to deconstruct their business into well, where can we make a difference? So they are prepared to make investments and take risks on short-haul battery electric flight. They are prepared to look at buying sustainable aviation fuels, which are heavily subsidised in California, and loading them for the Trans-Pacific flight. They are prepared to lean on the government to look seriously at funding the sustainable aviation fuels development in New Zealand, which will require a public subsidy. But you know, at least they're not in denial saying there is nothing we can do, or in denial saying it's a hard to abate, so somebody has to pay all the cost. Sustainable aviation fuel is not yet available in the volumes that would be needed to make a difference, but it looks like it's 3 to 5 times the cost currently of avgas. And fuel is about 1/3 of your ticket price when you fly. So if that 1/3 was to triple in price, it would add 50% to the price of your ticket. Would you still fly, or would you buy from the cheaper airline? So again, it's interesting to watch the switch in Fonterra. When I started in 2019, they were in denial. They saw it as a domestic political game to try and avoid the burden of adjustment. And Nestle and Danone and Tesco's basically came to them and said, we see emerging technologies that means we can buy meat and milk protein with about 30% less emissions in the foreseeable future. If you're not on track to achieve that, you need to be aware that we won't be buying from you. So, you know, again, I think there was a fundamental wake-up call at that point for that particular business. And it wasn't because of government regulation or local politics. It was because their customers basically said to them, sort it out or you won't be selling to us. And I think we're going to find more and more of those challenges begin to emerge in the space. And the business opportunity is to get ahead of history or to be killed by history.
Talking about the current and near future, I have to ask an AI question. So, in my view, the AI conundrum is quite complex in the sense that running these algorithms requires a lot of energy and power, yet they also present the opportunity to solve problems.
Yep.
What is your position?
Well, you heard me make the reference to if we double electricity production and consume it all in data centres yet to be built, it won't reduce emissions by 1 job.
Yeah.
We're still better to use renewable energy to power data centres than burn coal. So, you know, that's the... Secondly, I suspect when we look back, we'll discover that our AI processing is pretty inefficient. At the dawn of any new technology, when you look back, you go, wow, that was poor. We got better and more efficient at running these algorithms. So I think that will come to pass. In addition, the data centres will locate close to where the cheapest and most sustainable and abundant electricity generation is. So again, if you want to be host to those, you better have a comparative advantage in abundant, cheap energy. It's not clear New Zealand actually does have that. So the Infrastructure Commission has estimated that New Zealand has the potential to generate from renewable energy, wind, solar, run-of-the-river hydro, a little bit more geothermal, has the potential to generate 3 times the amount of electricity we are likely to need this century. That's only potential. You need capital and skills to realise the potential, right? But it also points out it's not infinite, that there are limits, and if we use it for one purpose, it's not available to use for another purpose. AI itself is not going to get back in the box, right? In the same way, we are not going to stop flying. We need to find sustainable aviation fuels for flight, and we need to find renewable energy sources to sustain an energy-intensive society, including AI.
Yeah. Thank you. Alrighty. Edison, one of our MBA students, is going to run around with a mic for questions. I'm sure there are a few. We have a question right here. Thanks, Edison.
Rod, in all your talk tonight, which was pretty good,
B plus.
you didn't mention buildings, emissions from buildings at all.
Yeah. So I'd count buildings in 2 classes. One is under the energy efficiency and waste. The half the buildings that are going to be here in 2050 are already here today. And it is nuts that we don't seriously think about the benefits of retrofitting insulation and more efficient use of sources of heat for heating of space and water in buildings. So that would be this. Yes, we should. When it comes to the built environment, the climate impact of building up is much less than the climate impact of building out. And so the Climate Change Commission has tendered advice to the government that we should reduce the barriers to building up, because more densely populated urban areas have, as it turns out, a smaller footprint on heating, cooling, transport, and that matters quite a lot. But that's not what the buildings are built of, that's where we build the buildings. And then we've got the question of what we build the buildings of, concrete, steel and wood. And some of that you're being sort of interested to see what's going on in the concrete industry, where they are beginning to crack the nut of decarbonising concrete production, even possibly making forms of concrete that will continue to absorb CO2, which would be kind of interesting. And steel making, in which we've already seen in New Zealand Steel's case that better use onshore of scrap will take 1 million tonnes a year out of our emissions profile. And they think there's more to be done there. So I think emissions from concrete and steel will go down, and the embodied emissions by using more timber where appropriate will be helpful. And it is now conceivable that you can build carbon neutral buildings where there's as much emissions embodied in the timber as there is emitted in the steel and concrete. We're not there yet, but that would be a pathway to carbon neutral buildings of the future. But the immediate low-hanging fruit for New Zealand is, why are we heating the air when we actually just want to heat the room?
Thank you.
Where does nuclear fit into this?
Well, nuclear, it's really interesting. In terms of the global energy production annually, looking at the numbers recently, of 615, whatever they, exajoules, I think they call them, you keep going up from mega to giga to tera to exa, of 615 exajoules of energy produced on the planet each year, 25 are from nuclear power. and 189 are from burning oil. So I suspect there is an increasing role for nuclear power globally. The Chinese are certainly rolling out massive programs of civilian nuclear power. The Brits are building a nuclear power station south of England that will generate 10% of all their electricity. But I don't think New Zealand needs nuclear power to meet our energy transition. And it turns out nuclear power is still relatively expensive, that you can descale it and do little nuclear like they do on submarines and ships, but it's really expensive per kilowatt hour. And so I think from New Zealand's point of view, we should just watch the world, and if somebody develops very small scale, cost-effective nuclear, we should be open to that idea. But I wouldn't wait for it, and I certainly wouldn't bet on it.
There's a question right there, and a question in the back. Sure.
I think you've just led nicely into my question, Rod. In New Zealand, we're pretty proud of our local ingenuity. How do we leverage or realise global ingenuity, using the example of some industries? Winemaking, sustainably, it's done pretty well in New Zealand and internationally. Public transport, Europe leads the way. We don't really get into that. So what are your thoughts on how we make better use of global ingenuity?
Yeah, I mean, over 30 years, I've read lots of studies about this thing about New Zealand innovation and entrepreneurship. And the difficulty is it often degenerates into a series of relatively high-profile case studies. It is far from clear whether New Zealand has a comparative advantage in innovation. We may have a comparative advantage in adapting a technology we see somewhere else to meet our own needs. We may have a comparative advantage in working with scarcity. So this idea that we have this massive New Zealand sort of can-do attitude, that's the optimistic way of looking at it. The other is a slightly pessimistic, we're a make-do society where we put up with stuff. We put up with leaky homes, we put up with cold and damp homes, we put up with unreliable cars. So it's not a can-do, it's a make-do attitude. So I think you have to be open-minded to unpick what is it that makes us think we are so innovative, where it may be we are pretty flexible, we are pretty responsive, we're good at looking around the world, seeing something and bringing it home. We may not be as successful at building something at home and taking it to the world. There's a whole research project.
There was a question at the back over there, Edison. Thank you. Great, thank you.
Tēnā koe, Rod. We have a biodiversity crisis as well, and we know that investing in biodiversity can also have co-benefits for carbon sequestration. And we know we've got a finance trouble or finance challenges as well. What are your views on reforming the ETS to incentivise other carbon sequestration methods like wetlands or premiums for native forestry, or bringing in a biodiversity credit system?
So the first thing is the ETS is broken. It's not fit for purpose. It's not a cap and trade system. It has unlimited access for exotic forests. We have an abundance of units that are already created, which are in the bank, which are pollution rights that the government cannot control. So to put some order of magnitude on that, currently in the bank, i.e. pollution credits held by those who might sell them to emitters or use them to emit themselves, is 180 million tonnes. New Zealand's annual gross emissions are 75 million tonnes. The idea the government can therefore manage emissions to within 1 or 2 million tonnes per annum is delusional. The idea that you could hitch more credits for more sinks without creating greater obligations would simply debase the currency even further. The Commission is already on record saying if you leave this emissions trading scheme as it is, by about 2035, there will be so many forestry credits and so little demand, the price is likely to collapse. And all the people who are getting the quantities of credits they expected will find that, like the currency in the Weimar Republic, they're not worth much. That is completely foreseeable. That is not revealing anything that is not in the public domain today. So I wouldn't add biodiversity credits to the ETS because you're hitching your wagon to a sinking ship. That's not to say that there shouldn't be an opportunity for some sort of ecosystem services recognition, but everybody is quick to say, well, I want recognition for my re-wetted once were wetlands. I want credit for my soil carbon enhancement. I want credit for cleaning up the water. That's fine. I don't see the parade of people putting up their hand to say, I'm prepared to pay for the water I degraded, the soil carbon I depleted, and the erosion that my monocultural grass has caused. So until you answer the question, who is going to pay for the credits, you don't have a system. And if the answer is, well, the taxpayers of New Zealand should pay, then the question becomes now or later. Because you can pay now with less health, less education, less social services, or you can put it on the tab and make the kids pay later. Other than that, there are no free lunches here. I think there is possibly a case going to be made that we should pay farmers as guardians of the land. And I think taxpayers want to be very careful that they get what they pay for. And that's not to say you couldn't design a robust scheme, but I think there are significant risks of paying the money and not getting the gain. On biodiversity, the biggest threat to biodiversity is the warming planet. The biggest contribution we can make to trying to erode the loss of biodiversity is to stop the combustion of fossil fuels in the open air.
There's a question there, and then we'll take one more question at the front. Yes, there you go.
You mentioned the role of the judiciary, and I wondered if you could expand on that and also comment on how it might be immune to political interference.
So it's pretty clear around the world. I think there are more than 2,000 legal cases on foot today taking various businesses or government agencies to court over various approaches to the question of are government and business actions consistent with, and then you can fill in the gap. Consumer advertising, consistent with crimes against humanity, consistent with commitments under international treaties, commitments governments have actually made and put into their own domestic legislation. So I think the invulnerability to allegations that business leaders and political leaders and bureaucrats are now taking actions unknowingly is hard to defend. As yet, there hasn't been a clear pathway to what judicial action might look like in New Zealand and how the judiciary might hold governments of the day accountable for the promises and commitments that are on the statute book. But there is the likelihood at some point that a case will be brought that will force a government to act consistently with the law. In the business context, I think there's even more vulnerability to businesses which claim things they cannot prove or assert things knowing them to be false. Call it greenwashing or fraud, but either way, I think there are increasingly activists who will use the courts to hold organisations accountable to be honest about what they are doing and the damage that their activities are causing.
There's one final question over here, and then we have to go out. I know, sorry. I knew there was going to be a lot of questions, but we can't stand between...
Besides, the drinks are out there. Right?
That's right. We can't stand between people and drinks and nibbles. Thank you.
Thank you. You've mentioned transport, and you've covered EVs being a thing for the general populace. I myself drive one. But you haven't touched on industrial freight, and I'd like to hear your opinion on how we could modernise New Zealand's freight system, primarily industrial rail, to bring it to a first world status where we actually use it.
Yeah, so I've got a few views. The first one is that this straw man that's put up of user pays for our roads, I think is a starting point that actually is quite a good one. But it was used in a very interesting way to essentially say, well, EVs are road users, EVs shouldn't get the exemption. And to be consistent, I don't have a problem with that, right? Roads are roads, and if you're using a car, whether it's an ICE or an EV, you should pay your fair share of the capital cost and operating maintenance costs of the road network. That would be good. But here's the rub. Heavy freight on New Zealand's roads. Now, my understanding, and I said it to the NZTA board and they agreed, was that the physics of braking, accelerating and cornering mean that if you double the axle weight on a vehicle, you increase by 16 times the forces on the road. Now, we have road user charges that charge a little bit more for heavy freight, not 16 times more. If you fully priced heavy freight for the capital costs and OPEX of roads, you would find that moving freight from road to rail made economic sense. Whereas today it doesn't, because the cost of lifting a container from a truck, putting it on a train, about $100, and lifting it off the train and putting it back on the truck, is such that because the trucks are not paying the full cost of either the environmental damage from their emissions or alternatively the capital cost and OPEX of the roads, there is no business case often to move from trucking to rail. So until we get that right, not much else is going to change. And then when it comes to the trucks themselves, it is pretty clear that there are going to be low emissions alternatives within the next 10 years at scale for heavy freight on road. Yeah. Yep, H.R. Richardson are onto it. There's another good case study of somebody who's trying to make a difference. But the really interesting thing is there are about 800 heavy trucks in New Zealand that account for 80% of heavy freight emissions. So you can build a spreadsheet with their number plates. You know what they are and who owns them and what they're doing. So yeah, heavy freight on road, definitely an opportunity.
Thank you, Rod, and thank you everyone for your questions. I realise not everybody got to ask their question, but I'm sure they can come and ask you shortly. Just to summarise, I think your "don't wait for Wellington" sentiment came through really strongly. But even if we did wait for Wellington, the difference that government can make is relatively small to what we as business can make. And we're in a privileged position to still have choices, and we, the leaders today, need to make those decisions and those choices. Thank you. Further drinks and nibbles in the foyer. Thank you, everyone.